We are here. We are here. We are here. How are you?
Apologies for a bit delay. I was having troubles with my PC as usual. So yeah, so just managed to get it sorted.
Well,
okay,
this is amazing. Two faces, and I can hear your voices. That's a good start.
Yes, we've got a bit of Diana Ross in the background. So
we can't hear anything, KP.
You can't hear it?
No, no.
Oh, right.
Oh,
okay.
It's fine.
All right. Okay, that's a bit weird. Right. So I guess let's get started. So welcome everyone today to another episode of Let's Take This Outside. We've So today we will be we have a special guest on. Before I introduce the person, I want to first speak to Sol. So Sol, how are you? How's your week been going? I know you've been very busy, haven't you?
Thank you. Yes, I am alive and kicking. If anybody remembers that show, I am very, very well, and I'm super excited to be here. Yeah, it seems like it's been a while, but good things come to those who wait. So I'm very excited. We got a very special guest in the house. We've got Mal Mitchell, and I'm super excited to hear about Mal and his adventures. And KP, how you doing? Are you well?
I'm good. I'm very good. I've been well, the weather's been absolutely wonderful this week in London, England. Been soaking up the sun. So yeah, I've been good, keeping busy as usual, trying to anyway.
Did you hear that thunderstorm last night?
No, I didn't know. I slept like a baby. I'm not sure. About that.
Hashtag Paul McKenna. Mal, how are you?
I'm fine.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So viewers, we'd like to first introduce a special speaker today, and his name's Mal Mitchell. And today he will be talking about himself, and it's all about you, Mal, today. That's what we're going to be concentrating on. About you.
I thought it was Madagascar.
So Mal, yeah, so welcome today. I first wanted to start off and first go through and really tell us who you are, what you do, give us a bit about yourself.
Okay. Right at the moment, I'm just, I suppose I'd describe myself as a writer, researcher, campaigner. For the last couple of years, I've been working as a volunteer on the Free Tibet campaigns team, and working on an independent writing project and doing research related to that. Before that, I spent 15 years working with a charity NGO working in Madagascar, and I was working from the London office with a focus on project development and fundraising, networking, and sort of things with a awareness raising slant and this sort of thing. And my sort of general background before that is in those general areas of alternative education, campaigning, sort of development, and arts, sort of therapeutically slanted stuff. So a bit of a mix.
Oh, right. Oh, that sounds wonderful. And so what really got you into, the direction of, volunteering and, the various other activities that you've been involved in? What first got you into, like being a volunteer? How did you fall into that? Is it something that someone told you, or is it that you went on holiday to Madagascar, or
Okay,
was it?
I mean, volunteering specific to Madagascar, that's actually the work which I did with this organisation working in Madagascar. I started off on a part volunteer basis, but I actually I worked there as a sort of no paid job. There's lots of other things which I've done on a purely voluntary basis. And as I say, I'm currently working with Free Tibet as a volunteer. But the work with the Madagascar organisation, that wasn't volunteering. But I got into it. I got into that whole thing of working with a focus on Madagascar very abruptly. I was looking at specifically for inspiration to write a children's story.
Oh, right.
At that particular time, this was in 1999, and I was looking for inspiration for that, and came across this fantastic picture of a ringtone lemur, which I might hang on.
Yeah, of course.
Got it right here. See if I can see if you can see this. So yeah, I was looking around for inspiration, and
oh, nice. Oh, right. So
and this went with the caption "Natural Born Matriarch," and I thought it's a very powerful matriarchal image, and so I started writing this children's story, and.
Right.
Started talking about the wonderful jungly land of Madagascar, which this lemur came from, and then I thought, hang on a second, just how jungly is it? What's going on there? And basically started then sort of did a bit of research, and then went back to this children's story. And I was going back and forth between research and writing, and this whole thing kind of snowballed, and I realised that I'd stumbled across something which was massive in terms of as a global conservation issue, but also massive in terms as a global development issue. What was going on for the people in Madagascar, sort of learning that it was one of the richest places on the planet at the same time as being one of the biologically richest. So that really captured me, and and I wanted to sort of put all my energies into that.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's how I got into that.
All right. And so I guess with your charity work that you did as well, is that where you got your idea on say writing say for a lot when you was working at a charity that you wanted to? Was that at the time where you were thoughting about writing the children's book, or? I'd
already started on the book, and it was doing the research for that.
Right.
That sort of, as I say, it got me more and more aware of what the situation was in Madagascar.
Right.
And as I engaged with that, at a certain point, it was, oh my God, I was just completely engaged with it and wanted to work on it in what for me would be the best way possible at that time. And found this organisation I wanted to work for, and started doing a mixture of volunteering and paid work, and then it eventually became paid work for this organisation. And the research kind of kept going and didn't really stop. The writing project continued, kept going back to the drawing board and trying out different things, writing it as a children's story, then trying it as a hard-boiled thriller, and writing it as a screenplay and various other things. And it did eventually get written as a novel.
Right, yeah. So I presume you're talking about the Lemurian Shunts.
That's the one.
Is that the name of the book? Yeah.
Lemurian. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to give us a quick background on what the book's about? And yeah.
Okay. There is a sort of website where there's information on it. I mean, it's basically. What's kind of written on the tin of it, so to speak, is that it was meant to be addressing conservation and development issues and related psychological and sort of subtler cultural issues. At the same time as engaging people with an adventure story, and I think it is an adventure story which is mainly focused in Madagascar. It sort of juxtaposes sort of present day Madagascar with present day London. And then alongside that, you've got Madagascar in around 1666, with London in 1666, and then it goes back even further in time. So it's a kind of adventure story which is kind of, it's motivated by trying to convey these things in a metaphorical way and engage people sort of variously with these issues, but it's trying to be a good story at the same time, and so that's what it tends to be.
Right, and you co-authored it with a lady, I presume,
That's
who
right, yeah.
is Narendra Le
Narendra
Ranavia.
Devo, yes.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah. So, and so what? So, both of you worked on. So, whose idea was to
Ah,
transform it into a novel, or was it just that you met her through your volunteering? Is
okay.
that how it came about?
That's that's a really good question, and it's in an area of something which is very sensitive, kind of difficult to talk about.
Oh, okay.
And it's it's a really important question, and it's something where I've got my sort of spiel in response to it, as it were. So, but it only goes so far. One of the key things behind the co-authoring, the way this is presented as a co-authored thing, is how so many things today we have particularly in the West, we have a very set idea about, this piece of music was written by this person, this novel was written by this person, and it's a very people get into this, it is my work, and draw a sort of a thick line around it, and that's mine, and it's as simple as that. And for me, it's just so not as simple as that. I find that with even the most original things, there are so many things which are feeding into that, which are influences, and it's hard to tease apart what's really one's own and what's an influence of somebody else's. So, for example, you might be writing something and you've got an image of a particular person, maybe an actor doing this thing or an actress, and their personality, feeds so much into the character you're portraying that to not somehow acknowledge that and to say, oh, it's all mine, it's all my creation, there's something false about that. And I find it ultimately kind of arbitrary, the way we claim sole authorship, and even go so far as to start trying to take to court people who we think are stealing our ideas and this sort of thing. So the co-authorship thing is kind of, I'm putting it out there as something which, as it's a bit of a smokescreen in a sense, and I want to raise this whole issue of who's written what, who's contributed to what, and the question of how much is this, a particular person or influence feeding into it. And I'm happy for, that's why I welcome the question. I'm not necessarily going to answer it in a straightforward way, but answer it in a way that's real for me and is addressing these questions, because to me it's a hugely important thing. And there's a huge amount which relates to, all that's going on in Madagascar, for example, in terms of let's say art, in terms of music, in terms of story creation. There's a vast amount of stuff going on a day-to-day basis, just in everyday life, and we can't quantify it, but we try to. And in the West, we seem to have it. This person did this person did this, and it's all sort of sectioned off, and this is yours, and this is what you deserve this recognition for, and you deserve this money for, and this whole thing. It's I question that mentality, and I think it's a mentality which needs to be questioned. So I refer to Narendra as representative,
right,
of so many people who are unsung heroines or unsung heroes who have, where there's something which is feeding in, and how somebody defines that at any given time usually relates to their particular set of motivations or perceptions at that time. Right. Motivations and perceptions. This is a very involved answer, but it's actually a big thing. It's a big part of this. So I'm kind of wanting to leave the reader of this book uncertain, or essentially questioning, and questioning what it means to ask the question. is this person alive or dead? Are they, maybe they were fictitious in the first place? Is it, if it's representative, is it a real person? Is it representative? And I'm going to attempt to be irritating and by not necessarily answering it in a way that might satisfy somebody at a particular time, and say that's as much as I'm going to say about that.
Right, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Sorry, extra waffling there on that one.
That's okay. So you know, I want to dwell more on your creative side, because you've said you write research as well as writing, right? So, and on your creative side, what kind of are you doing? Any like you say you've written this novel. Are you doing any other projects? Based on your creative side, like you said, you wanted to thinking of doing a play. You think you were doing like probably would you like to turn it into a film? Would you want to do something like that, or?
Okay, I mean a couple of things on that. I mean Lemurian shunts, for one thing. I wrote this thing with very much a seeing it, hearing it, smelling it as a kind of a movie with smells, and it just so much played itself out as it went along. Very vivid, and for me very exciting. And it was certainly part of my idea that how do you have an impact? How do you have how can you have a mass impact? Getting these issues across to people, and certainly it was part of the concept as well. Well, it would be great if it was made into a movie.
Yeah.
So that was certainly in there as an idea, and of course, I mean, in the course of writing it, there was the children's movie called Madagascar, which came out, which had an impact on kids. And you ask kids today, about Madagascar, and you say, do you know what kind of animals do you get in Madagascar? They'll typically say penguins because of this movie, which is not the case.
Oh,
and
right.
that's
Okay.
that's a whole that's a whole. But clear the impact. There's the potential for impact from whether it's writing or a movie, and the more things can. I do believe in that potential to have an impact in that way. So, but it's also things have got to be worth doing for their own sake. That's a book, for example, which is written with, it'd be wonderful if blah blah blah, but it is what it is. What I'm working on at the moment, what I've been working on for the last couple of years, is something which is set in the future.
Right.
And it's a different kind of thing, but a kind of a novel written in the style of a mixture of reports. And I started that 2 years ago. It was April 2016. I started this thing, and I kind of got to the end of it. Essentially got to the end of this first draft in January this year, and started rereading it. Thought, this is not readable. It's hard enough for me to read it, let alone anybody else read it, and which was a kind of depressing thing. But it's prompted me to do. It clearly needed a radical edit, and it's been kind of fun and interesting, and a kind of an interesting sort of learning challenge to try and rewrite it as a screenplay.
Oh, right.
To actually visualize something which I thought this could not be made into a movie, because there's so many things overlapping and so on. And I had this absurd idea of a movie where you have 5 screens. You've got a circle in the middle, and then 4 corners around it, and all these things going on. And
wow.
Which of course would just make people throw up more than anything else, probably. But anyway, yeah. So I have the idea of trying to put that into a screenplay format.
Mal, quick question. Yeah. Is there a movie that you've ever watched that you could compare to perhaps a real life situation which you've encountered?
Compared to what again?
If you've seen a movie that, or you've come across a movie that's very accurate in its portrayal of perhaps a nation state, maybe such as Madagascar, or maybe a country in Africa, whereby there's an uncanny resemblance between what's been portrayed in the film and perhaps what you've seen first time? Is there any type of movie or movie titles that...
This probably doesn't answer the question, but the movie that's come to mind, listening to you're asking it, is The Last King of Scotland.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
which as far as I know, was there was a fictitious Scottish doctor in there.
Correct.
And his relationship with Idi Amin is the sort of the centre of it, but that whole historical background is, as to the best of my knowledge, is historical fact. And I find that's a very interesting way of working. I think there's quite a lot of things that have explored certain histories through fictitious characters. I watched a very hard to watch movie the other day called I think it's called Colonia.
Okay.
And it's about a cult which was in Chile, and it relates to what it's connected with Pinochet's regime, and this whole thing, which was actually there. It was a cult, which was a kind of was a genuine cult in its own right, but it was also a cover for secret police activities in Chile. Some absolutely horrendous stuff. And it's a movie which has got I can't remember the name of the main male lead, but the main female lead is Emma Watson, and she's brilliant. They're both brilliant.
Right.
It's a very, very hard to watch movie, because you know that this historical backdrop is accurate, and it relates to torture, and it relates to this kind of this fascist regime that was and its links with regimes before it. So yeah, that comes to mind.
Mouse,
yeah.
I wanted to find out from your good self. I don't know if you remember back in the 80s, there was a charity called 24-Hour Famine. They were trying to raise liquidity for countries.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think they're trying to raise some money for children in Mozambique or one of those countries. 24-Hour Famine. So there's many different charities around the world, and arguably the way that they collect and distribute the money according to the laws and the tax loopholes that they use, are the mainstream charities to be trusted, and also branches off the mainstreams or independent charities, that are they to be trusted? In other words, if I'm donating money, and I don't like to use that word, if I'm investing money somewhere, how confident should I be that it's going to the right places, is what I'm saying.
Okay, I mean that's a really good question, and don't anyone stop asking it. It needs to be asked on an ongoing basis, and the answer is different every time. I think the answer is different whether you're talking about a particular organisation or a particular. There are organisations which might be operating really well at a particular time and are doing effective work and are honestly reporting on it and so on, and the momentum of that can keep going into a situation where it's not working so well. It's got a new board of directors or whatever it might be. It's no longer got the same impetus and know-how and motivation behind it, and it can kind of seeg unnoticeably into a bit of a different kind of entity. And there's only, I think it's. I'm really concerned that no one would ever throw the baby out with the bathwater and would say, right, I'm not going to support this stuff because it's too questionable. I'd say, there's so much out there which desperately needs support, and there's a lot of incredibly good work going on. But you've got to look into things, and you've got to do a bit of research, and we're always taking a risk. We only know anything up to a certain point, and it might turn out that you just sent 50 quid or something to an organisation which turns out to, it's not quite. I mean, a lot of people were shocked by this news recently about Oxfam. It just.
Okay. Yeah.
People would never have imagined that, and yet if they had sort of sat down at the time and think, what are all the possible things that go wrong? You think, well, it's a bunch of human beings. Who knows? But I think, as I say, I would emphasise not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And people do look for an excuse to not support things, which I think is a tragedy. But at the same time, it can be things can shoot themselves in the foot badly. Just an organisation which is, say, it's somebody's trying to raise funds for to save the Amazon rainforest or something, and they're sort of doing the equivalent of shaking a collection box on the street. And if they're shouting out statistics which are inaccurate, and somebody comes along and addresses that, then suddenly that person will lose credibility. The whole organisation which they're representing can lose credibility. Potentially that loss of credibility can go even further, because other organisations are sort of tarred by this misrepresentation, which makes people very reserved. So, I think it's the pressure's on to operate with integrity, and the pressure's on for organisations, and the pressure is on to a degree for people who want to support something to actually, look into it and try and get more of an idea. Is it a registered charity, for example? There are indicators of things which you should be able to rely on, but nothing's perfect, nothing's watertight.
Mal, I wanted to ask, have you ever lived in Madagascar or for a period of time, working with these charities, or have you just always been based in London and, having communication with your counterparties in Madagascar? Would you want to move out there for a period of time?
I was when I started working with this organisation, working in Madagascar. I was about to become a father, so I wanted to be in the UK. I wanted to be specifically in London with that. So it suited me to work in the London office of this organisation. It was a charity, registered UK charity, working with an NGO in Madagascar. So it suited me to do that. And after 4 years of working with this organisation, I left it and was doing my own thing, and that included going on doing a lot of travelling around Madagascar, going all around the island. So I kind of supported myself doing that, and then I went back to soon after coming back from that trip, I went back to work for that same organisation, and then I had my first sort of official site visit after a further 5 years, and then there was another one after that. So I've been on 3 trips to Madagascar altogether, and the last 2 were these sort of site visits as part of the organisation. So yeah, that's been my experience in Madagascar anyway.
Yeah, sure. So that's really interesting that you've been to Madagascar 3 times, and so really with those visits that because as with Madagascar, from the short essays that you've written, you have spoken about how it has horrendous and complex problems of chronic poverty, environmental damage, and wildlife losses. When you went there, did you experience those? And do you have any examples that you can share with us of those experiences?
Depending where you go, you can see them. You will. I know on my first visit, I was staying at one place where I stayed for a couple of weeks, a town right up northern Madagascar. Diego Soares is what it's generally referred to. It's not its Malagasy name, but this was a place where there were people who were crawling over rubbish heaps to find what they could to whether it's to eat or to make some money from or to reuse or whatever, literally crawling over piles of rubbish. And obviously you've got, anywhere where there are sort of people who would be regarded as tourists, whether you're NGO workers or whatever, sort of foreigners, you're gonna be approached by people who begging you for money or whatever. So you experience these things firsthand. You see the deforestation firsthand. It's easy to see because these things, the poverty and environmental destruction is very prevalent. In a way, the drivers behind these are a bit more behind the scenes. And one of the things in Madagascar at the moment is the political situation is particularly dysfunctional, and it's gone from dysfunctional to more dysfunctional. And right at the moment, it's heading for another presidential election later in the year, and there are sort of dodgy things going on in connection with that. There was I think somebody was killed within the last few days at a protest because the existing the current president's sort of power enclave is trying to tweak things to make it difficult for his position to be challenged, basically, and the opposition, the opposition parties are sort of up in arms about that. So yeah, it's not good stuff. It's very very deeply ingrained, and it's unfortunately gone very much from bad to worse, particularly since a coup on the island in 2009. So it's had 9 years of really of things getting worse. Although perhaps not in the last few years, my impression is not quite as bad as it was in the few years immediately after that coup. There's a government there which is certainly implicated in environmental damage, so selling some of it. It's keen to sell some of its rosewood so that it can get the finances to keep itself in power and this sort of thing. And it's some grim, complicated stuff, which isn't so unusual. I mean, you see the versions of this in so many places around the world.
Yeah. Okay. And in your essay, you talk about infrastructure. How parts of Madagascar, the infrastructure is really difficult, and really for the country to build on their infrastructure. But you did mention about China as well as who is one country that is has got a presence within that country. And my question is that because they've got in Africa, they're building schools, they're building infrastructure, they're giving back to the to the country. Is that the case in Madagascar as well?
Who's giving back to the country, you're saying there?
Because with China, like you say, there's a presence of companies, right? Who with natural resources, they've got some sort of companies who are there. And so my question is are they putting money back into the country like they do in, say, in Africa? Like in other parts of Africa? I
think it's mostly there's certainly no such thing as a free lunch in this situation, and I think China is approaching Madagascar in quite a full-on way and in quite a self-interested way. I'm very familiar with. I'm more and more familiar with the sort of the kind of way China operates from the work I've been doing with Free Tibet, where of course it's all about China and its impact. In Madagascar, you have a situation where, for example, you might have there was a relatively recent case of a Chinese gold mining company who want to go in and operate or develop their operation there, and there was a local Malagasy environmental activist who challenged the legitimacy of it and said, do you have the papers? And is this questioning how the legality of it, and that environmental activist was arrested and is something which has actually been fortunately taken up by Amnesty International because it's so outrageous that often tends to happen that the environmental activists in Madagascar are the people who get arrested, and that relates because the vested interests are very much on the side of the the money-making machine, and that goes all the way back to the government, the prime minister, the president. And China is extremely interested in getting this hardwood like rosewood, ebony, which is not meant to be. It's illegal to log it, and the government actually has a massive stockpile on it, which it would love to get the sort of international trade laws changed or tweaked or whatever it is, in order to be able to cash them in, basically. But I think it's in question as to whether they're to some degree doing that anyway and getting some funding through that. So China is part of that machine.
Oh, right.
That is extracting more from Madagascar than it's giving. You can question. It can be very easy to go in and sort of do and present this glossy project of, hey, we've built a school. What good is that school if the people go to school and then there's nothing after it? You need to build infrastructure at all levels. So that's something. So it can be very easy to be quite manipulative with you sort of build this school, which needn't cost much money just to build a basic wooden building, and then you sell this story that you're doing something completely wonderful, when it might not be so simple. And of course there are great organizations that are building schools and are looking at those and addressing those questions, but there are others and where those questions aren't being addressed to the same degree. And certainly when it comes to the sort of China's impact, it's certainly I can't think of an occasion where I've read something about a Chinese input which has left me feeling warm and rosy inside.
But Mal, on the flip side of the argument, what is a brother supposed to do?
What is, say again?
What is a brother supposed to do? Metaphorically speaking.
In terms of, you're talking about China here?
Well, I'm talking about both parties, because Madagascar as an island is a very large island, but I don't think its GDP is where it could be. So they've got nothing to really trade with, or what the buyers on the market, they're not interested for whatever reason.
Yeah,
okay? They're being frozen out. Fine. So the Chinese come in and they say, we're going to add or provide some type of mobile solution, whatever. We'll invest in various different projects. Yeah, well, it's a superpower. That's what superpowers are supposed to do. They take the lead, they take charge. They're not thinking about human rights. So realistically, this is nothing new. But the difference is, unlike the British or the other European powers that came and was using the sharp end of the stick to beat your ass into gear, the Chinese are not doing that. They're using the economic powerhouse enabled to manipulate. But at least they're not doing it in the old brutal colonial fashion. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think I'm sure it's the first thing to be said, or it's amongst the first things to be said, to emphasise that whole colonial background, and particularly for people in the UK. I remember years and years ago when I started off by trying to get people over the phone, trying to get people to contribute money to projects in Madagascar. And they say, well, charity starts at home. What's Madagascar got to do with me? And the more I learned about the relationship between Madagascar and the UK. This is I'll work my way around to what you were saying, Solly, but I want to sort of emphasise this, because you had, for example, there were slave ships which were taking Malagasy people off to Barbados. This is, and they were from England. We don't have. It's not that this people in this country have nothing to do it, and we all know, or that's nonsense to say we all know. It is known how massive the significance in psychological, in economic, in political, in social, in all terms, that whole background of transatlantic slave trading is. Its impacts go on today variously. all the inhumanity and injustice of those, that is not history. It's stuff which has an impact. So that's all true, and it's all it's glaring, and it's rightly known, and it's not known enough. We so easily forget it as a culture. It seems to me. But comparing it to China, I think for me. And as I say, and bear in mind that with China, if I was looking at China purely from the point of view of Madagascar, I would certainly have a different perspective to how I think about China in broader terms because of its impact in Tibet, for example. But in terms of the sharp end of things, there have been some fairly brutal and aggressive approaches, and I think, Solly, as you're saying, they're going in saying, we're going to be the boss here, and that has been a particular issue for local Malagasy people, saying, well, they're glad in the first place to get the jobs, but eventually, if you're treated in a bad way, you will eventually say, no, please, I'm not up for this, and react with in a more physical way to it, and there's certainly been cases along those lines. So
Matt, why do you think there's a richer north and a poorer south? In a very abbreviated, short way, from your own reality, why is there a disparity in wealth across the nations?
Okay, because I was very interested to hear the answer to that question that you got the other day, which I kind of agree with, but I think one can go more into the story. And if the short answer is colonialism, I think it's interesting to look at what is psychologically behind colonialism. What's that whole mindset? What drives that? And I do think that it has to do with. I do think there's a gender issue which is in there. I do think this has to do with what blokes do, what blokes do when they're free to operate without restriction, as opposed to any culture where there is a balance between the male and the female, essentially between the women and the men, but including the girls and the boys, literally. So I do think that the tragedy for our planet, which we characterise as colonialism, there is a deep gender aspect to that, and I think it's and going, and you can talk about it in psychological terms, in social terms, in cultural terms. You can begin to talk about it in sort of physiological terms. Say, look, the problem is essentially testosterone, which might sound absurd, but I think there's something in that. I think the way men are driven, specifically men, will be destructive unless that energy is metabolized in ways which we tend to not see. But we do occasionally see examples of, like the image which comes to mind is the American woman who was standing there. I think this was a recent or last year a Me Too thing, where you had all the police and just the one woman standing there, and a woman stands up to the male power. That's which takes absolutely incredible bravery, and there's so much which is working against that. So.
Yeah, but Mal, hold on, buddy.
I'm going off on one.
The reality is, we see this type of behaviour and challenges in the animal kingdom. Let's look at ants, for example. Yeah. They do the same bullshit. They go into an ex-territory because of a demand for food, to feed the queen, to feed the babies. Rampage like fucking Vikings and terrorists. It's the same thing. Let's look at killer whales. They do the same thing. They prey on other dolphins. They prey on other marine. They are an apex predator and are highly intelligent. So again, we're looking at the polarization of superpowers, where it's basically superpowers in this chaotic environment fighting for survival, is it not?
Yes.
Okay.
So
what you're saying is because we're human, we should try to eradicate.
We should
try to eradicate this negative experience from our consciousness, but it's part of the fabric of this existence that we had no obligation to be here or be present, but we were selected, and the rules have been laid down. And I'm not saying human rights issues is not important. Of course, there's a vast difference between Mother Teresa and Bill Gates. So that's how wide we can look at this whole subject matter. But human rights, we all live in a world of choices, and down to the choices that we make and our thinking patterns inevitably will produce the circumstances, situations and events that precede the way that we think. Right?
I think I'm still with you, yeah. But
yeah, we're just going in.
what I just to go in on a few of those points. I mean, one is no, I wouldn't be talking about eradicating anything. Something which, but it's sort of like how we is about what we do with that energy, how that is, how we see that, what sort of context we put on it, which is very culturally influenced, and like, you know, something which might be taboo in one culture, in a certain situation, suddenly, you know, there's a change in economic circumstances, and suddenly you start to, you know, things change. That you can think of examples in Madagascar with that, where there might be a taboo against killing lemurs, for example. But then you've got there's a lot of people moving from one area to another, and these local taboos are breaking down because you'll get, you know, somebody moves into the area and suddenly they start killing and eating the lemurs, and it begins to erode local culture. But that's a whole big complex area. But one of the things which you just strongly put me in mind of with that is something, a point made in a book by Temple Grandin, in a book called Animals in Translation, where she talks about Darwin and the sort of the survival of the fittest, and talks about the origin of species, and says the word love is in there a very great deal, whereas the expressions, I think the particular expression which, whether it's survival of the fittest or whatever, but it's the one which we associate very strongly and which has been reiterated so much culturally. You know, this is what Darwin was saying, but actually Darwin did make these points about our capacity for sympathy, our capacity for empathy, our need to cooperate, and how this can make us different from, you know, what goes on in the so-called animal world. I mean, interestingly, we do have these tendencies to idealize things. It's very easy to do with something like dolphins, for example. But yeah, you can find examples of dolphins gang raping or whatever it might be. And yeah, so there's not a. Are you still there? Sorry.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. So it's not about eradicating, but it's looking at what any society at any given time gives us license to do, and it's like suddenly, you know, you've got it's like so much is held at bay because society does not give us license to do it, whereas suddenly if the lights go out and everything in your freezer is, you know, all the electricity goes off, 3 hours later there's looting on the street, then people feel a license to do that, and the rules apparently change.
The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins.
The Selfish Gene, indeed, and of course Dawkins is well known for emphasising that side of what Darwin was saying. But this is what I was saying about Temple Grandin's book. She's emphasising that actually Darwin took a very broad picture of things, and was emphasising that capacity for cooperation and sympathy.
Yeah, look. I definitely appreciate, you know, what you're saying. I definitely do. Let's look at the war in Iraq, how we took down Saddam Hussein, for example. So whichever way you look at it, I guess the motive was peace. but ended up in a disaster.
Yeah.
Right. So let's kind of use that as a template, and let's look at the Chinese. It's inevitable that this situation in Madagascar, but it's no different again in what's happening in Latin America with oil companies and high-tech companies that are basically dissing the system, abusing the system. Right. So again, I mean, the human rights aspect is very, very valid. It's very, very valid. But I also do think that sometimes we have to allow the citizens of that nation state, and they've got to do it for themselves. Because if you look at the war in Iraq, statistically speaking, not many Iraqis wanted the Americans or any other foreign invaders to deal with the situation.
Sure.
And same in Uganda. It's the same blueprint model. So in this case, in Iraq, the Americans came when they removed the leadership, and the whole country went to shit. If you look at Uganda, Idi Amin, he drove out the Asians, the Indians, and again, you saw that collapse in infrastructure. We saw it again in Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe was again dissing the system, right? But what I'm trying to say is, and this is my point, we can only do so much. And at the end of the day, there's more power in the collective. So it's down to the collective to stop relying on outside help. And of course, in many situations and circumstances, there is no choice. We have to go and we've got to do something. And I get that. But again, in depressed circumstances, it has to be down to the nations, the people that make up that nation state, to create a revolution.
Yeah, and what comes to mind immediately with that is Cuba, and it's weird, it's interesting, and it's inspiring, and it's kind of bewildering as well with when you think about something like Cuba, which is often referred to when people say, "Hey, where's communism ever worked?" And people say, "Well, Cuba has got this great health system, this great education system, and so on." And when they were at that point where they were cut off from, I think when there was a particular severance with America, and they're starting to grow, all this stuff in there, all this growing of vegetables and fruits going on in the city and this sort of thing. Brilliant stuff. Quite often, something kind of bad, something horrendous suddenly coming down can really trigger or somehow facilitate or prompt a flip in the way people do things in a substantial way, and you find a better way of doing things. But it's complex. Very complex.
What I've seen is again with superpowers, right? They are politically ingrained in that country, and they are the ones who actually nominate who should really be the next president or who should be the next prime minister of that country, right? So in the Arab states, US foreign policy has always determined who the next dictator will be, right? So my question for Madagascar is: China having an influence politically in choosing the next leader of that nation? Are they kind of putting in these seeds of who they want as a leader, so they will get what they want? And is there the opposition leader, is he strong enough to try and go against that and not to go with say like China's foreign policy on dictating who should be the next, the next president?
Okay. Yeah, really good question, and I've got very, very limited sort of knowledge that's relevant to the answer. And I think it's something where there's going to be limited knowledge anyway, because I think we're probably talking about so much which is behind the scenes with this. Now, as I say, there is a link that China has a particular interest in this hardwood from Madagascar. It's a massive and growing trade thing that's valued by the sort of rising middle class in China, and basically who knows what's behind the scenes in terms of the links that China may have with the Malagasy current president, and his sort of clan of people, or his whatever the most appropriate word is for the kind of the way in which his people are in that that power structure which is in place at the moment, which has its overlaps with the so-called opposition. The opposition, there isn't an opposition leader as such. There's two of the main contenders, to the best of my knowledge, for the presidency would be one, firstly, the guy who was in power as a president from, I think it was something like 2002 to 2009, the guy who was ousted by a coup, and the other guy who's a main contender is the one who ousted him, who was the head of a so-called transitional government for a few years before the current president was in power. So I would say there's great uncertainty, and it's a hard question to answer. What I do know is that sometimes these realities may never emerge. One of the certainly with this coup that took place, there's a big dynamic in Madagascar with whether people are sort of Madagascar was a French colony up till 1960, and the relationship with sort of French in business and trade terms and so on, and political links, there's always been a sort of a bit of a dynamic between that as opposed to links with the UK and America and the sort of non-Francophile side of things. And that was a dynamic in this coup that took place. It went from somebody who was sort of veering towards the UK and America in terms of links to somebody who was very much there with French interests. And it did emerge a few years after this coup that there was a potential link in terms of, and it's something which has never been proved because it's so behind the scenes, but it was along the lines that there seemed to be a bit of a smoking gun in terms of evidence of Texaco Oil having interests in developing the tar sands and other heavy oil deposits in Madagascar, and this was put forward as a as a potential explanation of what drove this actual coup, which had such a tremendously damaging impact in Madagascar, and that Texaco Oil, via sort of French diplomats and so on, that money got to the army and facilitated this coup. There are certainly indicators, and there's a whole there's a basis in economic reasoning that people might so that could well be what took place. But of course, it's to the best of my knowledge, no one's ever proved it. But one of the key things is that only emerged years later. This is really sort of behind the scenes kind of stuff. Yeah. And it wouldn't surprise me. Any number of possibilities wouldn't surprise me in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. So the answer to the question of China, I would be, I would ask a good question to ask around, and but I would certainly be reserved about any categorical answer you might get to that. Certainly a categorical yes or a categorical no, unless somebody can actually, there really is evidence for it, because it's inherently likely to be something which is behind the scenes.
Right, I wanted to ask, because we had a conversation about technology, and so in Madagascar, like when you went on your travels, was there technology in the country where you were able to is there a strong growth within that country on technology? Are there investments from corporations coming in trying to fill the gap, in terms of educating the people in schools and for example?
Yeah, well, there's certainly, I mean, you will find in the towns you will get internet cafes, and there's you'll be able to find those things easily enough, but you'll be you'll be finding those things in the same building that may not have a toilet, and they're
Oh, right.
this sort of thing. I mean, there's a huge difference between rural and urban areas on any question like this, and certainly. But you can be surprised. You'll be out in a rural area and suddenly a laptop might appear. Of course, NGOs and other organisations are working in these areas, and quite often that becomes a sort of a conduit for technology getting into that area. And in other cases, there are sort of major plans for trying to get that sort of information facilities out there. But it's
really ironic. Do you know what I find really ironic? I'll tell you what I find really ironic is that in China, right, there's a certain percentage of the Chinese population that are going through exactly the same hardship, right, as the people of Madagascar in terms of lack of resources.
Yeah.
And I would imagine I don't. What is the population of Madagascar?
The population at the moment is in the region of 26 million people.
Okay. So it's interesting.
That has doubled. When I started working with this organisation, early 2000, the population was 13 million. So it is in that time doubled. And that's a big factor in everything we're talking about, of course, when it comes to Madagascar.
But again, this is very. I mean, it's very much tribalism. At the end of the day, we saw it in Rwanda. We've seen it in South Africa. We see it in Nigeria. It's all tribalism.
You get that in Madagascar, yes, certainly. And that has got its own political function.
You get it in the Premiership if you like watching soccer.
Sure.
Football. It's tribalism. You're either a Blues fan or you're a Reds fan, a Red Devil, whatever. It's the selfish gene. But in the words of Alexis Tsipras, the Greek Prime Minister, it's not a Greek problem, it's a European problem. Well, actually, it's an endemic African black cultural problem. That's the reality. Because the nation of Africa has the most diversified people on the planet, number one. So the gene pool is amazing. The land, the continent, is so vast, it's so fertile that we have all these great resources, but yet the very continent, the very nations that produce these resources can't even afford a fucking refinery. What the fuck? So it's a very very interesting dynamic that we've got going on. So clearly, manipulation is taking place. Yes?
Yeah, and right across the board. I mean, in any human sphere you care to name, you will find sort of tentacles reinforcing what's going on, and essentially you've got, whether you look through a lens which is focused on psychology, on economics, on politics, on philosophy, you will see all these different dimensions feeding into and generally reinforcing each other. So yeah, the tragedy of all the African nations, which as a whole, is that the situation is so entrenched. It would take it's not going to be a revolution in any one nation that's going to sort that out. It's probably going to be a case of things at a global scale changing quite dramatically. Which
are you into? Do you subscribe to any type of conspiracy theories? Just generally speaking.
Yes and no. I mean, what I was just saying about the stuff which goes on behind the scenes, and I mean, when it comes to Texaco oil, for example, and the oil interests and how they would operate, certainly I would that seems likely to me, and it's a cop out to say, oh yeah, but you can't prove it. There was such to me it seemed there was a real smoking gun there. So that's. And I think that's just one little edge of what I would think is a very likely scenario of sort of non-state interests, in other words, corporate interests, impinging on and pushing around what's going on at a state level. I mean, if you look at American history, the history of American intervention, there's you begin to see certain patterns, and then some things which break radically with those patterns in terms of the kind of, you know, the kind of style of ruling a country that they might support or combat. You know, and I do think these relate to layers of things, patterns behind the scenes. So certainly, and broadly speaking, I think yes. I think there's so much more going on in human affairs than meets the eye, and there's certainly there are big funds which are going into making sure that they, you know, they don't hit the whatever. You know, you have going back to say the work of the environmentalist Rachel Carson in the early 1960s, where she was saying, hey, look at the apparent impact of using these particular chemicals in agricultural industry, in terms of, you know, the chemicals which they were using as pesticides and fertilizers and so on, saying, look, there's a relationship between these and cancers popping up. And there were funds of hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever that went into trying to disparage her reputation and to trash her as a human being and as a scientist. You know, this stuff is, and that's just one tiny example, but you know, again, that's a bit of a, you know, you get away with that and you've got a conspiracy which is worked, basically.
Is it capitalism gone mad?
That might be a good way. That might well be a really good way of putting it, I think, because I think. But the tricky thing is, can there be a version of capitalism which isn't mad, given our nature, given our tendencies? You know,
Sorry,
equally, I mean, people might say, you know, is China an example of communism gone mad? Because for some people, they would say, look, communism is rooted in communality. There's a lot of, you know, valuable, there's a lot of sound ideals within. But to broaden the question, you know, are we a species that's gone mad? We do seem to be, in the main. You know, and that's not to disparage us as a species completely, because certainly there are some amazing things which we come up with as a species, and there are some great things going on in terms of people finding different ways of living on the land and different ways, different relationships with the environment and so on.
But the thing is, look, we're going for a different age right now.
Yeah.
You know, we're not in the Bronze Age anymore, or the Iron Age, or the Golden Age. We're in the IT age, and with that, you would expect there to be more common sense because we have so much access to more technology, more information. But actually, do you remember that picture of evolution? You got the fucking organism, and it turns into an ape, and then into a
standing up straight with the computer.
That's right, and then Homo sapiens, right? Well, imagine that picture with technology moving forward, but in the reverse. So we're going back to the ape, despite all this information technology we have all around us. So I guess then the argument must be there's a lack of common sense going on here, or it's been deliberate. But I don't know. It's very interesting, because how do you tame man's need for knowledge? And I mean, you can't tame technology. You can't tame a way a man thinks.
I think. I think yes and no to that. Interestingly, talking about you can't tame technology. It's just put me in mind of another an interesting and disturbing book which I've been looking at, called "The Scientist, the Madman, the Thief, and Their Light Bulb" by a guy called Keith Tutt, and it's all about various technologies which people have been like cold fusion, for example, and the explorations of those, and it really emerges how there are massive vested interests which try to crush this stuff, to quash information getting out there, and they do actually literally manage to more than clip the wings of some of these potential technological developments. I mean, there's case after case. I think there are lots of I think there are potential other ways we could have gone rather than basing our world economy on fossil fuels, which is.
Think of Elon Musk, the billionaire engineer inventor. What do you think?
Don't know anything. The name rings a bell, but I really don't know any more than that. You tell me.
Have you seen these electric cars called Teslas on the road, or have you heard about them?
I've heard about them. That's all. Yeah.
Okay, so this fella, Elon Musk, he has put these cars into production. So basically, humble beginnings, started up PayPal, sold the company, used that money, invested every last dime into Tesla car, which is electric cars, a solar power company, and SpaceX. So I don't know if you're aware, but Puerto Rico went through a very severe hurricane. And the country is being powered using Tesla technology, using Elon Musk's international backing to make all this happen for that one country. So what I'm trying to say is, there's an argument on both sides, isn't there, really? Communism, as I've mentioned before, it only suits other species, but not human beings. And yes, there's definitely flaws in capitalism. One person can't rule 350 million people. It's just stupid. But there is no, what is the real alternative? Oh yeah, I know what it could be. We could all become network marketeers, but not everybody wants to do that bullshit. So there is no real model to be governed in terms of policies and economics, is what I'm trying to say. So therefore, it must be down to us to see the world in all its positive light, become the best version of ourselves, and either create a charity where you know that wherever you invest your resources, you're going to get some type of goal achievement. But I think a lot of the issues with the human rights community is that they don't have the resources, and they're relying too much on government aid. Some of these NGOs, I mean, they're raising liquidities. The model of business used to be very different from that of the private sector, but they've realized that they can't compete. So the entire structure, the entire business model is very similar to that now of a private company, where back in the day it never used to be, because the motivations were different. So for people that are really keen, that really want to make a change, surely they have to make a change in their own local environment first before they can start to duplicate this change to other areas,
sure,
and other aspects.
Yes, indeed. I mean, one of the things that, I mean, listening to what you're saying there, I think one of the things which comes to me there with it is that whilst, for example, we may not, it can seem to think of alternative models can be very different, but that is in itself a kind of a way of thinking. And I come back to this thing of a gender bias and the you know, the potentials which we have to feel our way intuitively, to have a more holistic kind of take on things, where we are factoring in things at different dimensions in a more, and integrating them more effectively. I think if we're really doing that, then we're not necessarily going to be able to have the answers off pat so easily. A banal thing which comes to mind with that, maybe not totally banal, but it puts me in mind of an image in a movie called Alive, which is based on this actual tragedy which happened of a plane with a football team crashing in the Andes.
Oh yes.
Many
they started to cannibals each other. They started to eat each other, wasn't it?
Oh yeah,
that's right. But one of the things I was just thinking that the particular element of it, which I was just thinking of there, was how the guy who was the head of the football team, after this crash, he attempted to sort of be the leader in that, and to be in control of the situation. And one of the things which was kind of interesting, and it's hard to explain, but the film brilliantly just plays this thing out in front of your eyes, and it's how that leadership style, which is very male-dominated, straightforward, I'm telling you what to do, it just didn't work. And there's somebody who's unconscious at that point and very weak, but this person finally comes round and kind of steps into that kind of leadership role, but very organically, and it's a very different thing to the usual being elected or getting yourself elected as the leader. And it's a very, it's how something can potentially emerge organically in terms of a new way of doing things, in terms of a new way of integrating different systems. And
wouldn't it be amazing? Wouldn't it be amazing? Sorry. Just before I hand back to KP, Val, wouldn't it be amazing if you look at sort of the pop industry, the music industry, the mainstream, and look how much influence and power that they've got, just based on the amount of followers they have on Instagram, YouTube, whatever. Could you imagine if they started to really take seriously, started representing a cause, that just by having eyeballs on a particular charity cause actually can do a lot more in terms of alleviating the pressure that charities are facing just through the power of social media?
Yeah, definitely. And I think occasionally that gets recognised, and people say, "Oh God, I've got some clout here," and people can put their celebrity power to great effect. And there are people who occasionally do that. And there's certainly a huge amount of untapped potential in that kind of area in terms of celebrities getting on board with things. But I would add a note of caution in that years ago I was involved with an environmental group called the Ark Trust, and it got a lot of celebrity endorsement at the time, and there was kind of all sorts of people, big names in the pop world and in the film world were involved, and even on its board of directors were pop artists. But this thing got sort of taken over by a very corporate thinking kind of particular individual and his colleagues, and it went in a whole different direction. So there is this huge potential, but the sort of dangers that go with the ignorance and motivation, particular kind of motivation that might also go with that.
Right, I wanted to ask about just a quick question about NGOs. So I just wanted to get your opinion in that. Do you feel that the NGOs that are helping Madagascar in different areas, their vested interests from that particular country, if it's the UK or US, is just to show the wider community that they are trying to address these problems, but really that there's a different agenda because they've got vested corporations within that country? So do you feel NGOs are being directed by these corporations on telling them, that we are trying to do something, but really we're trying to get away from the issues of what the corporation is really, like, say, petroleum? You
Sure.
say like Total are their petroleum company, and they're pumping out, God knows how much oil from that country. And so are these NGOs just like being funded by these corporations? Really?
I mean, I think it's a very mixed, complicated story, and I think and you occasionally get these sort of real shock headlines that can come out of it. Like, I know a number of years ago it came out about the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, and the sort of the questions about the particular interests which were driving who they had relationships, and it was observed that the board of directors was no longer made up of people who had a conservation background and so on, but they were corporate people, and that's a big parallel to the situation I was just describing in the Ark Trust, where you had a switch in the general characteristics of who's actually pulling the strings behind the organisation, and it can certainly happen, and it's certainly I think you've got to accept that it's somebody who I used the phrase, who I had a conversation with not so long ago, and used the phrase messy compromise, and I think that's a good way of characterising this guy. Was using it in specific reference to Madagascar, but with a general suggestion that it was more broadly applicable. And I think it's true. There's a lot that's a messy compromise, and and if you're looking for perfection, you're probably never going to start anything. You've got to be ready to sort of dive in and get a bit mucky and do your best as you go along and try and improve things. And I think so I think this, you might well, I mean, any organization which is out there is going to be needs to get money from somewhere. Now it's going to be getting money from people who quite often have vested interest in giving them those funds, whether it's a big organization or it's an individual wanting to salve their conscience or whatever it is. But I think that the more there can be upfront, honest dialogue about this, the better, because there's a huge amount which is just behind the scenes.
Right. Okay. So before we wrap up, what's coming from your side, Mal, in the future? What's your next project? I know you say you're writing another novel. Is there anything else that you want to tell our viewers they should look out for? And of course we'll give the blog as well, like your blog that you write and stuff.
Okay. Well, yeah, the Lemurian Shunts is waiting for Ridley Scott or whoever to come and make that into a movie, and the one which this thing which I'm converting into a screenplay is that's what I'm busy with, but that's
am I right? Am I right? You're dabbling into a bit of acting as well, I hear.
Oh yeah, a little bit on the side, and doing a drama therapy class at the minute,
right.
And there's an in joke between me and Solly there.
No comment. Absolutely no comment.
And but I'm looking to resume some training in counselling later in the year. Something I was doing some years ago. Started doing. I actually started doing. It's about 6 years ago. I started doing training to be a counsellor with two things in mind, which was to feed in that thinking to build my capacity working in international development, thinking of that all those connections between what we call international development and what we call personal development, and that particular interest in those relationships. And but on the other hand, potentially building a foundation to actually go off further in that direction of doing counselling type stuff. And I've just sort of come around to looking to resume that at the moment. So later in the year, I'm hoping to re-embark on that kind of training.
Fantastic. We would love to have you back. Right. So
okay.
I'd like to thank you very, very much for coming on today, Mel. Thank you for giving us your time. I know it's very precious. As you can see, you got a lot going on. And so I'd like to thank you for all that. And Sol, do you have anything else you would like to?
No, it's been a very interesting conversation. It's been interesting to listen to obviously now, and it's always a pleasure. And I think we'd like to get you back on, and we'll talk about. We want to talk about Mal the man. let's dig deeper into Mal, and that'll be quite. I think that'll be quite interesting because you're a very interesting, well-travelled person. So you've got a lot of value to offer that I know that myself and others out there would be very interested in learning more. So do you have like contact details? Do you have like an Instagram page, a YouTube channel, any type of social media that people can connect with you on? There are two sort of web pages, blog pages, which I've got for Lemurian Shunts, for another book which I wrote called The Hog's Holy Wash, and a general one. So I think you might have a link to one of those, or I could send you it. Sure.
Yeah, I've got the link to that. Yeah, it's in your blog, isn't it? So
yeah,
definitely. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone.
Well, thank you.
And
thank you.
And we'll speak to you soon. All right, take care, everyone.
And each other.
See you later. All right, so bye everyone.
Bye.